The Nighttime Visitor. Part 1. It started innocently enough, as most terrifying experiences do. One lazy Sunday afternoon, a notification buzzed on my phone. It was a Facebook friend request from an old high school buddy, Tom. We hadn't spoken in over a decade, but his profile picture, though aged, was unmistakable. The nostalgia kicked in hard, and I accepted his request. Within minutes, Tom messaged me, "Hey, long time no see. How's life?" We exchanged pleasantries, reminisced about the good old days, and soon the conversation took a surprising turn. "I've been traveling a lot for work," he said. "I'm actually in your town this week. How about we catch up in person?" The idea of reconnecting in real life was exciting, if a bit unexpected. I agreed, and we arranged for him to come over the following evening. Tom arrived just after sunset. I greeted him at the door, noting how different he looked in person, a bit more haggard than his profile photo suggested, with shadows under his eyes and a nervous energy about him. But the warmth in his smile was genuine, and soon we were sitting in the living room, beers in hand, swapping stories. As the night deepened, the atmosphere began to shift. It started subtly, with the occasional odd noise, a creak here, a whisper of wind there. I brushed it off as the house settling or the usual night sounds. But then, objects began to move. At first, it was small things, a coaster shifting slightly on the coffee table, the remote control nudging to the edge of the couch. "You saw that, right?" I asked Tom, my voice tinged with nervous laughter. He nodded, his expression serious. "Yeah, I did. There's something I need to tell you." The air grew colder and a shiver ran down my spine. Tom's eyes darted around the room as if expecting something or someone to appear. I've been having these strange experiences ever since I visited this old monastery in Eastern Europe," he began. "I think something followed me back. I didn't want to believe it, but it's real." My heart pounded as Tom recounted his eerie encounters, the shadowy figure that lurked in his periphery, the cold, oppressive feeling that followed him everywhere, and the whispers, those damned whispers that filled his nights with dread. "I thought maybe if I stayed with someone else, it might leave me alone," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. A chill ran through the room, and suddenly the lights flickered. We both froze, our eyes darting towards the hallway where a dark figure stood. I couldn't move, my body paralyzed with fear. The figure drifted closer, the air growing colder with each step. The whispers began, unintelligible and haunting, filling my ears and mind with a sense of impending doom. Tom grabbed my arm, his grip tight and desperate. "It's here," he hissed. And then, with a sudden sharp gust of wind, the lights went out. The room plunged into darkness, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Items in the room began to rattle and shake, a cacophony of chaos surrounding us. In the pitch black, I felt something cold brush against my cheek, a sensation so chilling it felt like my skin would freeze. The whispers turned into a cacophony of voices, each more menacing than the last. "Tom," I screamed, but my voice was swallowed by the darkness. The night was just beginning, and it was clear we were not alone. Part 2. I fumbled for my phone, its screen the only source of light in the oppressive darkness. I turned on the flashlight, casting an eerie glow over the room. The shadows danced on the walls, and for a moment I thought I saw something slithering in the corner. Tom's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "We need to get out of here," he whispered, barely audible over the relentless whispers. As we stood to make our way to the front door, the temperature in the room plummeted. My breath came out in visible puffs, and my fingers felt numb as I tried to grip the doorknob. It wouldn't budge. It was as if the door was glued shut. Tom and I exchanged a panicked glance. "The back door," he said, and we sprinted through the kitchen, our footsteps echoing in the stillness. As we passed the dining room, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The chairs were no longer around the table, they were stacked in a precarious tower in the middle of the room. I didn't remember seeing that when we came in. A loud crash from behind made us jump. We turned to see that the stack had collapsed, chairs scattered across the floor. "Go! Go!" Tom urged, pushing me forward. We reached the back door, but as my hand touched the knob, the whispers turned into a deafening roar. It felt as if 100 voices were screaming directly into my ears. I clapped my hands over them, trying to block out the noise, but it was useless. Tom grabbed a chair and hurled it at the glass pane of the door. The glass shattered, and for a moment the noise subsided. We climbed through the broken door, cutting our hands and knees on the jagged edges, and stumbled into the backyard. Outside, the air was still and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos inside. We stood there, panting and bleeding, the cool night air soothing our raw nerves. For a moment I thought we were safe. Then I saw it. A shadowy figure stood at the edge of the yard, just beyond the reach of the porch light. It was tall and indistinct, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. My heart skipped a beat as it began to move towards us, gliding silently over the grass. "Run!" Tom shouted, but my legs felt like lead. I could only watch as the figure drew closer, its presence sucking the warmth from the air. Just as it reached the edge of the light, it stopped. The whispers returned, a hissing chant that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I could see Tom's lips moving, but I couldn't hear him over the noise. The figure raised a shadowy hand, and the whispers grew louder, more urgent. Suddenly Tom stepped forward, his face set with grim determination. "I brought this on you," he said, his voice clear and strong despite the chaos. "I need to end it." Before I could stop him, he walked towards the figure. As he approached, the shadow seemed to recoil, its form flickering like a dying flame. The whispers turned into a wail of rage and despair, and the air grew colder still. Tom stopped just a few feet from the figure and turned to look at me. "I'm sorry," he said, and then he stepped into the darkness. The figure enveloped him, and for a moment I saw Tom's face contorted in pain. Then, with a final ear-splitting scream, the shadow and Tom vanished, leaving me alone in the cold, silent night. The whispers stopped. The air warmed. I stood there, trembling and numb, staring at the spot where my friend had disappeared. The terror and confusion washed over me in waves, but deep down I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Part 3. In the days following Tom's disappearance, I was a wreck. Sleep eluded me, and every creak of the house set my nerves on edge. I tried to convince myself it had been a nightmare, a product of my overactive imagination, but the cuts on my hands and knees told a different story. So did the shattered back door and the broken glass scattered across the kitchen floor. I spent the next few days cleaning up, repairing what I could, and trying to regain a sense of normalcy. But the feeling of being watched never left. Every time I turned a corner, I half expected to see that shadowy figure lurking in the darkness. It wasn't until a week later that the real terror began. It started small objects moving when I wasn't looking, strange sounds in the middle of the night. I found my keys in the freezer one morning, my toothbrush in the living room the next. I chalked it up to stress and exhaustion. But then, the whispers returned. At first they were faint, barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator or the rustle of the wind outside. But they grew louder each night, a sinister chorus that filled my dreams and turned them into nightmares. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, the whispers still echoing in my ears. Desperate for answers, I began to research. I scoured the internet for stories of hauntings, possession, anything that might explain what was happening. I found forums where people shared similar experiences, and I posted my story, hoping for guidance. One night, as I was browsing yet another paranormal forum, I received a private message from a user named Shadowseeker. "I've read your story," it said. "I can help you, but you need to trust me." I hesitated. The message was ominous, and the username didn't exactly inspire confidence. But I was desperate, and curiosity got the better of me. I responded, "What do you know about this? What's happening to me?" The reply came quickly. "You're being haunted by a dark entity. It's feeding off your fear and growing stronger. You need to banish it before it consumes you." My heart raced as I read the words. How do I do that? Shadowseeker's instructions were detailed and specific. I needed to cleanse the house with sage, sprinkle salt at the doorways and windows, and recite an ancient incantation to banish the spirit. It sounded like something out of a horror movie, but I was willing to try anything. The next day I went to a local metaphysical shop and bought sage, salt, and a small booklet of incantations. The shopkeeper, a kind elderly woman with wise eyes, gave me a knowing look as she handed me my purchases. "Be careful," she said softly. "These things are not to be taken lightly." That night I followed Shadowseeker's instructions to the letter. I lit the sage and walked through the house, the smoke trailing behind me as I chanted the incantation. I sprinkled salt at every doorway and window, forming a protective barrier. The whispers grew louder as I worked, a chorus of angry, disembodied voices protesting my efforts. When I finished, the house was silent. I felt a sense of relief wash over me, and for the first time in days, I slept peacefully. The peace didn't last long. The next night, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever. The temperature plummeted, and I felt a malevolent presence closing in. I grabbed my phone and frantically messaged Shadowseeker. It didn't work. What do I do now? The response was almost immediate. You need to confront it. Face your fear. It's the only way. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down I knew it was true. I had to face whatever was haunting me, or it would never leave. With trembling hands, I set my phone down and took a deep breath. I walked through the darkened house, the whispers growing louder with each step. They seemed to come from everywhere, surrounding me, closing in. I stopped in the living room where Tom and I had first noticed the disturbances and called out into the darkness, "Show yourself!" For a moment, there was nothing. Then slowly, a shadow began to materialize in the corner of the room. It grew darker and more defined, taking on the shape of a tall, menacing figure. The air grew cold, and the whispers turned into a cacophony of hissing voices. My heart pounded in my chest, but I stood my ground. "Why are you here? What do you want?" The figure moved closer, its form shifting and writhing. "You cannot escape," it hissed, the voices blending into one. "You belong to us." A wave of terror washed over me, but I clenched my fists and took a step forward. "No, I will not let you take me." The figure paused, its form flickering. The whispers grew softer, uncertain. I took another step forward, my fear giving way to anger. "You are not welcome here. Leave now and never return." The shadow wavered, then began to dissolve, its form breaking apart like smoke in the wind. The whispers faded, and the air grew warmer. In a matter of moments, the figure was gone, and the house was silent once more. I stood there, breathing heavily, my heart slowly returning to its normal rhythm. I had faced my fear, and the entity was gone. But as I looked around the empty room, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Part 4. The days that followed were eerily calm. The whispers ceased, the house felt warmer, and I could finally sleep through the night without waking up in a cold sweat. I wanted to believe that it was over, that confronting the entity had driven it away for good. But deep down, a nagging feeling told me otherwise. One evening I received another message from Shadow Seeker. "Well done, but be vigilant. Entities like these are rarely banished permanently. It may try to return." I shivered, reading the words over and over. I had hoped for reassurance, but instead I felt a renewed sense of dread. Determined not to live in fear, I decided to take proactive measures. I researched more about protecting my home, even considering reaching out to a professional paranormal investigator. A few days later, my doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. As I approached the door, a chill ran down my spine. What if it was back? I cautiously opened the door and found a man standing there. He was tall, with a serious expression and an air of authority about him. "Hi, I'm Mark," he said, extending his hand. "I'm a paranormal investigator. I heard about your situation from a mutual acquaintance. It took a moment to process." "Shadow Seeker?" Mark nodded. "Yes, I've been following your case. May I come in?" Relief washed over me, and I stepped aside to let him in. We sat in the living room, and I recounted everything that had happened, from Tom's visit to the night I confronted the entity. Mark listened intently, taking notes. When I finished, he leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "You did well facing it, but these things are tenacious. They feed on fear and despair. I need to conduct an investigation of your home to understand the full extent of the presence." We spent the next few hours going room to room. Mark set up equipment, from EMF detectors to infrared cameras. He explained each device's purpose, and I found some comfort in the methodical approach. It felt like taking control of the situation. As night fell, Mark suggested we sit quietly in the living room, observing any changes. The house was silent, almost peaceful. But around midnight, the atmosphere shifted. The temperature dropped, and the familiar whispers began to creep back. Mark's equipment lit up. "It's here," he said, his voice steady but tense. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. The shadowy figure began to form in the corner just as it had before. But this time I wasn't alone. Mark stood beside me, holding a small vial of holy water and a crucifix. "We need to weaken it before we can banish it permanently," he explained. "Stay close." As the entity approached, Mark began to recite a prayer, sprinkling holy water in its direction. The shadow recoiled, its form flickering and distorting. The whispers turned into a roar, a cacophony of anger and pain. I clutched the crucifix, repeating the prayer under my breath. The figure moved closer, its presence oppressive and cold. Mark continued to chant, his voice growing stronger and more confident. The entity let out a final ear-splitting scream, and then, with a burst of cold air, it vanished. The room fell silent, and the temperature began to rise. Mark lowered his hands, his face pale but determined. "It's weakened, but not gone. We need to perform a ritual to banish it for good." Over the next hour, we prepared for the ritual. Mark instructed me to gather certain items: candles, salt, a mirror, and a personal item belonging to Tom. I found an old photo of us from high school and brought it to the living room. Mark arranged the items in a circle and lit the candles. He sprinkled salt around the perimeter, creating a protective barrier. This ritual will draw the entity out and trap it. We must remain focused and strong. We sat in the circle, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows on the walls. Mark began to chant, his voice steady and rhythmic. I held the photo of Tom, thinking of our friendship and the bond we shared. As Mark's chant grew louder, the air in the room thickened. The whispers returned, filling the space with their insidious murmur. The shadowy figure appeared once more, but this time it was drawn to the center of the circle. The entity writhed and twisted, its form growing darker and more defined. The whispers turned into screams, a symphony of agony and rage. Mark continued to chant, his voice unwavering. Suddenly, the mirror in the center of the circle cracked, and a blinding light filled the room. The entity let out a final soul-piercing scream before being sucked into the mirror. The light faded, and the room fell silent once more. Mark collapsed to the floor, exhausted. I rushed to his side, helping him sit up. "Is it over?" I asked, my voice trembling. Mark nodded weakly. "Yes, it's over. The entity is trapped in the mirror. It can't harm you anymore." Relief washed over me, and I hugged Mark tightly. The nightmare was finally over, or so I thought. As we cleaned up the remnants of the ritual, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. The house felt different, quieter, but not entirely safe. Mark assured me that the entity was contained and that it would no longer pose a threat. But deep down, I knew that this experience had left a mark on me, a scar that would never fully heal. The memory of the shadowy figure, the whispers, and the cold presence would haunt my dreams for years to come. I thanked Mark for his help, and we parted ways. As he drove away, I stood at the doorstep staring into the night. The darkness seemed deeper, more impenetrable, but I felt a glimmer of hope. I had faced my fear and survived, and though the road to recovery would be long, I knew I had the strength to walk it. Part 5. Life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. The nights were quiet, the house felt lighter, and the oppressive atmosphere had lifted. I even began to sleep soundly, free from the relentless whispers and icy chills. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to believe that the ordeal was truly over. A month passed without incident. My routine settled back into place, and I focused on work, hobbies, and reconnecting with friends. Yet, despite the calm, a part of me remained on edge, wary of the shadows in the corners of my home. One evening, I decided to sort through old boxes in the attic, a task I had been avoiding since the night Tom disappeared. I needed closure, and organizing the clutter seemed like a good start. As I climbed the creaky stairs, a chill ran down my spine, but I brushed it off as residual anxiety. The attic was a mess of forgotten memories, dusty photo albums, old clothes, and childhood toys. I worked steadily, discarding what I no longer needed and setting aside items to donate. It was almost therapeutic, a way to reclaim my space from the lingering fear. As I sorted through a box of old-school memorabilia, something caught my eye, a small, leather-bound journal. I didn't recognize it, but the sight of it sent a shiver through me. Curious, I opened it, flipping through the yellowed pages filled with faded handwriting. It wasn't mine. It was Tom's. His handwriting was unmistakable, and the entries detailed his experiences from his travels. The later entries, however, grew increasingly erratic, filled with desperate scrawls about the entity that had followed him, the whispers, and his growing paranoia. One entry, dated a week before he reconnected with me, sent a chill down my spine. I can't escape it. It's always there, watching, whispering. I don't know what to do. If anyone reads this, know that I didn't mean for this to happen. I thought coming here would help, but it only made things worse. I fear it's too late. The last entry was dated the night he arrived at my house. I'm so sorry. It's stronger than ever. I thought I could handle it, but it's consuming me. If you're reading this, please forgive me. A tear slipped down my cheek as I realized the depth of Tom's torment. He had come to me out of desperation, seeking refuge, but instead he had brought the nightmare to my doorstep. As I sat there, processing the journal's contents, a sudden cold breeze swept through the attic. I looked up, and the air grew heavy, oppressive. The shadows seemed to stretch and deepen, and the familiar dreaded whispers began to fill the room. I clutched the journal to my chest, my heart pounding. "No," I whispered. "This can't be happening again." The whispers grew louder, more insistent. The attic light flickered, casting eerie, shifting shadows on the walls. I backed away, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The darkness coalesced in the corner, forming the all-too-familiar shadowy figure. My mind raced. Mark had assured me the entity was trapped, but it was clear something had gone terribly wrong. I had to do something, anything, to protect myself and my home. I sprinted downstairs, grabbing my phone to call Mark. As the phone rang, the whispers followed me, growing louder with each step. I reached the living room, my heart pounding, and glanced around for anything I could use to defend myself. Mark answered on the third ring. "Hello? Mark, it's back," I blurted out, my voice trembling. "The entity, it's here." There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end before Mark responded, his tone urgent. "Are you sure? How did it? I found Tom's journal in the attic," I interrupted. "The whispers, the cold, it's all happening again. What do I do?" Mark's voice was steady, but I could hear the underlying tension. "Listen to me. We must reinforce the protection around your house. I'm on my way, but you need to start without me. Get the salt and sage. Do you remember the incantation?" I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Yes, I remember." "Good. Begin the ritual. I'll be there as soon as I can." I hung up and rushed to gather the supplies. The salt, the sage, the booklet of incantations. I laid them out on the kitchen table, my hands shaking. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, and the air felt like it was pressing down on me. I lit the sage, the familiar scent filling the room, and began to walk through the house, reciting the incantation. My voice wavered, but I forced myself to continue, sprinkling salt at every doorway and window. As I reached the living room, the temperature plummeted, and the shadowy figure appeared once more. It was closer this time, its form darker and more defined. The whispers turned into a guttural roar, and I could feel the malevolent presence closing in. I stood my ground, clutching the sage and the salt. "You are not welcome here," I shouted, my voice gaining strength. "Leave now and never return." The figure recoiled, its form flickering. The whispers grew chaotic, desperate. I continued to chant, my voice rising above the noise. Mark burst through the front door, carrying his own supplies. He joined me in the living room, his presence a reassuring force. Together, we chanted the incantation, the combined power of our voices pushing back against the entity. The figure writhed, its form breaking apart like smoke in the wind. With a final ear-splitting scream, it vanished, leaving the room in silence. Mark and I stood there, panting and exhausted. He placed a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm. "It's gone. For now." I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and lingering fear. "Thank you." Mark smiled faintly. "We need to make sure it stays gone. This time, we'll seal the house properly." We spent the next few hours reinforcing the protections, marking every entry point with salt and sage, and reciting the incantations until the house felt secure. As dawn broke, I felt a sense of peace settling over the home. Mark gathered his things, preparing to leave. "Call me if you need anything," he said, "and be vigilant. Entities like this are persistent." I thanked him again, walking him to the door. As he drove away, I took a deep breath, feeling the first rays of sunlight warming my face. The battle wasn't over, but I was stronger now. I had faced the darkness and survived, and with Mark's help, I knew I could keep it at bay. For now, the house was quiet. The whispers were gone, the shadows receded, but I would never forget the lesson I had learned: some battles are never truly over. They simply change, and we must be ready to face them when they return. Part 6. In the days that followed, I felt a cautious optimism. The house felt safe, the whispers were gone, and for the first time in weeks, I began to believe that the nightmare might truly be over. Mark's words echoed in my mind, a reminder to remain vigilant, but I allowed myself to breathe a little easier. One evening, as I sat on the couch with a cup of tea, I decided to read through Tom's journal once more. I needed to understand what had happened to him, to find any clues that might explain why the entity had returned. As I flipped through the pages, a pattern began to emerge. The entries grew darker and more desperate, each one hinting at the entity's growing power and influence over him. There was one entry that stood out, written in a shaky hand and almost illegible. I found it. The source. It's an old relic, a piece of dark history. I thought it was a souvenir, but it's cursed. It binds the entity to me. I need to destroy it, but I don't know how. I froze, my heart pounding. A cursed relic? That had to be the key. If Tom had brought it into my house, it was still here, hiding in the shadows. Determined, I set the journal aside and began to search the house from top to bottom, looking for anything out of place, anything that might be the relic Tom had mentioned. Hours passed, and my search turned up nothing. Frustrated, I sat down on the attic stairs, the last place I had found Tom's journal. As I rested, my eyes wandered to a small, dust-covered box tucked away in a corner. I hadn't noticed it before. Heart pounding, I crawled over and pulled it out. The box was old, the wood dark and worn. I hesitated, my hands shaking as I lifted the lid. Inside was a small, intricately carved figurine, unlike anything I had ever seen. It was unsettling, its features twisted and malevolent. This had to be it, the relic that had brought the entity into our lives. As I held the figurine, a wave of cold swept through me, and the whispers returned, faint but unmistakable. I had to destroy it. "But how?" I called Mark, my voice trembling as I explained what I had found. "Bring it to me," he said urgently. "We need to deal with this together." I wrapped the figurine in a cloth and placed it in a bag, my hands shaking the entire time. The drive to Mark's place was a blur of tension and fear, the whispers growing louder the closer I got. By the time I arrived, they were a deafening roar. Mark opened the door, his face grim. He took the bag from me, carefully unwrapping the cloth. He stared at the figurine, his expression darkening. "This is worse than I thought," he muttered. "We need to perform a cleansing ritual, one that will break the curse and banish the entity for good." We spent the next hour preparing, gathering candles, herbs, and other items for the ritual. Mark explained each step carefully, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to my rising panic. Finally, we were ready. We set up in Mark's backyard, the moon casting an eerie glow over the scene. We arranged the candles in a circle, placing the figurine in the center. Mark began to chant, his voice low and rhythmic, as he sprinkled herbs and salt around the perimeter. I joined in, repeating the incantation he had taught me. The air grew cold and the whispers intensified, a chorus of angry, desperate voices. The ground seemed to tremble beneath us, and the shadows around the yard grew darker, more oppressive. As the chant reached its climax, Mark lifted the figurine, holding it high above his head. "By the power of light and the strength of our will, we break this curse and banish the darkness." He threw the figurine into the fire we had built in the center of the circle. The flames roared to life, consuming the figurine in an instant. The whispers turned into a deafening scream, a final cry of rage and despair, before fading into silence. The air grew still, the temperature returning to normal. Mark and I stood there, panting, our faces lit by the dying flames. It was over. The curse was broken, and the entity was gone for good. I thanked Mark, tears of relief streaming down my face. "I don't know how to repay you." He smiled, his eyes tired but kind. "Just stay safe. And remember, you're stronger than you think." As I drove home, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The house was quiet and warm, the shadows no longer threatening. I knew the road to recovery would be long, but I was finally free. That night I slept soundly, free from nightmares. The house was my sanctuary once more, a place of peace and safety. The darkness had been banished, and I was ready to reclaim my life. The experience had left scars, but it had also taught me strength and resilience. I would never forget Tom or the nightmare we had faced together. And as I looked forward to the future, I knew that I could face whatever challenges came my way. The nighttime visitor was gone, but the lessons it had taught me would stay with me forever.